Hey everyone! Today I'm diving into a speech that didn't get the attention it deserved. John Dramani Mahama's powerful address at the 71st UN General Assembly. Now you might wonder, why did Western nations ignore this? Well, let's unpack it.
Thank you, my brother and President of the 71st session of the United Nations General Assembly.
Mahama made a compelling case for Africa. He argued that Africa doesn't need sympathy or aid. No, what Africa truly needs is a fair chance to trade on the global stage.
His Excellency, on behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana, and I invite him to address the Assembly.
Africa is rich in resources, and Mahama stressed that these resources can guarantee a decent life for every African.
I am the President of the Republic of Ghana. I was born 1 year after my country gained independence from colonial domination in 1957. I was born in the same year as Michael Jackson, whose untimely tragic death shocked the whole world. Michael was also known as the King of Pop and was one of the greatest entertainers that ever lived. The words of his 1991 hit song, Heal the World, continues to echo to us from his grave. Michael Jackson sang, and I quote, "Heal the world, make the world a better place for you and for me and the entire human race." His song was released in 1991 and came at a time of excitement for the whole world.
There's a place in your heart, and I know that it is love. It's a place much brighter than tomorrow.
In the 58 years of my life, I have seen the world change more rapidly than in the millions of years of its existence. My life has spanned the excitement of the post-war era, the heady days of our liberation from colonial rule in Africa, the Apollo moon landing, the Cold War, the excitement at the fall of the Berlin Wall, the era of globalization, the end of apartheid, the global progress of the MDGs, the Arab Spring, Brexit, China's slowdown, SDGs, ISIS, cyber attacks, and it goes on and on and on and on. Mr. President, our world today is more complicated than it has ever been. And the question I ask is, what happened to the ideals that gave birth to this organization, the United Nations? What happened to that enthusiasm that captured the spirit of the post-war world, that envisioned peace, safety, and security for all of mankind? What happened to the excitement at the thawing of the Cold War? And what happened to our joy at the collapse of apartheid? The era of the Cold War created a paradoxical safety and security. The bipolar world and the arms race assured mutual destruction from any nuclear war. And therefore the world was a more predictable place. Those of us in developing countries hid behind our shield of the non-aligned movement. We marched against nuclear armaments and envisioned the day the nuclear arms race would end, so that the trillions of dollars that were being spent by the superpowers on nuclear weapons will yield a dividend that will create a life of prosperity for all people on earth. President Reagan stood before the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin in 1987 and said, "Mr. Gorbachev," I quote, "Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Quotations closed. In President Reagan's words, walls cannot withstand faith, walls cannot withstand truth, and walls cannot withstand freedom. The fall of the Berlin Wall envisioned a new world, the era of globalization, an age where trade and interaction amongst people of the world would spread prosperity across the globe. It did somewhat, the rise of the Asian tigers, the emerging world, China, Brazil, South Africa, India, the 10 of the millennium and the MDGs raised millions of people out of poverty. A young man in West Africa drops out of school and takes to selling petty items along the streets of the city. Agreeing with 4 of his friends, they decide to raise money and try to make it to the greener pastures of Europe. They paid their way through Niger and arrive at Agadez, from where they brave the trek of death. This is a dangerous hike across the harshest desert on earth, the Sahara. They are attacked by bandits along the way and robbed of all their money and provisions. They are rescued by some good Samaritan. 2 members of their group do not make it through the desert crossing. After months of living under the threat of death from many of the armed groups, including ISIS in Libya, they finally board an overloaded dinghy bound for Italy. Rescued from the sea after their dinghy capsized, only one of them remained, held in a refugee center in Italy. He is the lucky one, the only one of 5 friends to survive this perilous journey. How long he will remain in the detention center, he does not know. And this could be the story of any young African seeking a better life in Europe. Mr. President, all over the world, there are new walls coming up. Walls that imprison us against the rest of the world. The young African refugee in an Italian detention center is facing one such new wall now. In many parts of the world, extremist forces have hijacked the dialogue, and in the millennial generation, all available cutting-edge technology is being used to spread anxieties that evoke fear and arouse our basest emotions. Hate speech is becoming common. People complain of being tired of being politically correct. In many places, xenophobia has taken over rational thinking. In the vote on Brexit, the specter of a flood of Syrian refugees was used as the instrument for propelling an exit from the European Union. It is a paradox of our world that nearly 30 years after President Reagan called for the Berlin Wall to be torn down, new walls are springing up everywhere. And yet we have the resources in this world to guarantee each person a decent life.
Africa is rich in resources, and Mahama stressed that these resources can guarantee a decent life for every African.
In the implementation of the MDGs, despite the minimal resources that were injected by the wealthy nations, we managed by prioritizing our spending to put more children in school than ever before in our history. We managed to pull more than 40% of the world's people out of extreme poverty. In Valletta, the European Union put 1.8 billion euros into an emergency fund to cooperate with Africa in curbing unregulated migration. And yet, with a significant share of the world's arable lands, a youthful labor force, a significant share of the world's natural resources, a reordering of economic relations could create boundless opportunities that will keep young Africans at home and not risk their lives across these perilous journeys. Removing subsidies to farmers of the advanced world will create an even playing field for African farmers to compete. Removing revenue and non-revenue barriers to African produce would give African agriculture a fighting chance. Mr. President, some of the young Africans who hazard the desert and the Mediterranean Sea to cross to Europe from my country are young poultry farmers or other entrepreneurs who sell their shops and undertake the journey because they can no longer compete with the tons of frozen chicken dumped on African markets annually, or the adverse business environment they have to face. Africa does not need your sympathy or overseas development assistance. Africa needs a fair chance to trade with the rest of the world and amongst ourselves.
He emphasized that Africa wants partnerships, not pity. Mahama's vision was clear, a future where Africa is an equal player in global commerce, and not just a recipient of aid. So why did Western nations turn a deaf ear? Perhaps it's because his message challenged the status quo. It called for a shift in power dynamics and economic relationships. This speech wasn't just a plea, it was a bold statement of self-reliance and potential. Mahama's words were a call to recognize Africa's capability and to foster true economic partnerships. In a world that's increasingly interconnected, ignoring such a vital message is a missed opportunity for everyone. So let's give Mahama's speech the attention it deserves and rethink how we engage with Africa.
The progress towards the creation of a continental free trade area is commendable and must be fast-tracked. Raising intra-African trade alone from the paltry average of 15% will create better business opportunities for African youth. We can achieve a lot in collaboration with the rest of the world, and yet we must realize that a lot also rests within our own capacity to achieve as Africans. Recently, I took the decision as president to allow citizens of other African countries traveling to Ghana to obtain visas on arrival. This would stimulate trade and investment if it were replicated across the whole of the continent. Structural reforms are required in many areas. Governance is also a critical area that requires reform in Africa. Democracy unleashes the creative juices of our citizens. Africa has made remarkable progress. Elections are held regularly, civil society groups and think tanks have become more vocal, and the media is increasingly free. And yet there's a lot more that we can do to allow Africans the space to express themselves. Democracy is not a one-size-fits-all system. Different countries are at different stages of the democratic journey. Democracy evolves and cannot be forced on a people. It doesn't help for biggest powers to go proselytizing democracy across the continent. It can have its negative consequences, as we're experiencing in parts of North Africa and the Middle East. But still, a properly functioning peer system can avoid some of the meltdowns we're experiencing in some African countries due to the desire to remain in office interminably. Mr. President, the mistake with Africa is that we're seen as a homogeneous unit and treated as such, not taking cognizance that we are a whole continent with different aspirations, different cultures, democracies, and even economic development. Human progress is not a seamless movement forward. It encompasses periods of reversal, mistakes, fumbling, and even falling. All parts of the world have been through this. They have learned from their mistakes, they've picked themselves up after a fall, and they've continued moving forward. Africa must be allowed the same latitude. A few years ago, the term African Rising painted a continent on the move. Recent headwinds experienced due to China's slowdown and the collapse of commodity prices have got some African skeptics gloating again over how nothing good can come out of this continent. Africa is a continent of 54 countries at different stages of progress and development. And there must be room for us to make our mistakes and learn from those mistakes. Africa has the potential to be the next continent on the rise. There's a lot going for Africa. There are many success stories on the continent. Africa has the fastest growing population, meaning a very youthful labor force. It has the fastest growing middle class with increasing disposable incomes. It has the fastest growing information and communication technology networks in the world. Africa needs strengthened institutions, and we're working to build them. We must ingrain transparency and integrity more and more in our governance systems. President Obama said on his historic visit to Ghana that what Africa needs is strong institutions. We must strengthen our institutions of governance to eliminate the incidence of corruption that impoverishes our people. Mr. President, my country, Ghana, is a part of Africa's success story. I'm proud of my country. We're variously called the model of democracy in Africa or the beacon of democracy. We've not looked back since the adoption of our 1992 Constitution. Successive elections with power occasionally swinging between opposing political parties has established Ghana's democratic credentials in the world. A strict two-term limit for the president means that every 8 years it is guaranteed that there will be a new person in charge. Ghana has a fiercely independent media with hundreds of newspapers and radio stations. And I always say jokingly to my colleagues that in Ghana, I have 27 million presidents, all of whom know my job better than I. And every morning, on the political talk shows across the country, my fellow citizens can be heard coaching me on how to do my job and what my responsibilities are as president. Mr. President, bold measures in effecting structural reforms have yielded a more stable and resilient economy with a deficit to GDP target of 4.9% this year, among other favorable targets. With a stable currency, business confidence is rising, and foreign direct investment remains very strong. Ghana has been chugging along at a respectable average of about 6% GDP growth rate over the last decade. With the structural reforms we have undertaken in collaboration with our development partners and new developments in our offshore oil and gas prospects, Ghana is predicted to clip along from next year at a respectable 8% growth per annum. Over the last decade, we have invested heavily in expanding our socio-economic infrastructure. Investments in healthcare, education, power, water, roads, and ports are yielding significant dividends for us and are creating more employment opportunities for our young people. These investments are yielding dividends in improved healthcare, increased enrollment at all levels of the educational ladder, improved transportation systems, the growth of small and medium enterprises. With the modest progress we are making, we're able to recapture the vision of the founder of our nation. And it is a happy coincidence that on his birth anniversary, that is today, I have the opportunity to address the world from the prestigious platform of the United Nations General Assembly. Today, the 21st of September, marks the birthday of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, from whom many of our current generation of African leaders draw inspiration. President Kwame Nkrumah was a champion of African liberation and a staunch Pan-Africanist. I wish all my countrymen and women a happy Founders' Day. Mr. President, 2 years ago, I stood on this stage, and in my capacity as the chair of the Economic Community of West African States, I called for urgent action to halt the spread of the Ebola virus disease, which was ravaging 3 of our West African neighbors and threatening to spread across the whole of the sub-region. Today, I stand here to salute Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and the United Nations for the prompt response in setting up UNMIR, which was based in Ghana. UNMIR will probably go down in the history of the UN as one of the most successful and effective missions ever deployed by this organization. I salute also the international community for the effective response in the form of logistics, personnel, medication, and other material which helped to snuff out the disease in a relatively short time. But my particular commendation goes to the brave volunteers, including 41 of my own countrymen, who risked their lives by going into the infection zone to assist fight the disease. Ghana remains proud of its contribution towards ending that crisis and the support to the UN system and the international community when we availed our country as the staging post for the international response and the UN mission on Ebola emergency response, despite the threats. Following the Ebola response, the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, Norwegian Prime Minister Erna Solberg, and I wrote to the General Secretary General, calling for a high-level panel to prepare a report that allows the world to respond better in times of such global health crisis. We're faced with such a situation already in respect of the exponential spread of the Zika virus. We must use the lessons learned from the Ebola crisis to confront this new threat. Mr. President, another threat we must confront together as a united world is the threat of terrorism. No part of the world is safe. In our sub-region, the activities of Boko Haram in northeastern Nigeria and the Chad Basin has displaced millions of people and claimed thousands of casualties. Attacks in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Cote d'Ivoire show that all our countries are at risk. Terrorism is currently one of the gravest threats to world peace and security today. We cannot be under any illusions about the imminent threat to all of us, even as we go about our daily activities. But the solution is not to shut out our doors to foreigners who may have genuine cause for visiting, for tourism, for business, for sanctuary as refugees. That is what the terrorists would want us to do, to instill fear and panic in us in order that we shut our doors on the rest of the world. Ghana stands in solidarity with all countries that have experienced terrorism recently. Bangladesh, Belgium, France, Germany, Indonesia, Lebanon, Pakistan, the Russian Federation, Turkey, and of course the United States of America. No, we must not give in to them. The terrorists must not win. They cannot win, and they will not win. Mr. President, I wish to commend the United States and Cuba for the progress made in thawing the relations between the two neighbors. We've all been watching with excitement the removal of some of the last vestiges of the Cold War with the reopening of embassies in the two capitals, the historic visit of President Obama, and the resumption of flights between the two countries. It is time to take the remaining steps to completely lift the blockade on Cuba, and it is my hope that this can be achieved. And it is my hope that this can be achieved before President Obama's administration leaves office. Mr. President, Ghana once again wishes to reiterate its support for a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There is no military solution to this conflict, and Israel's security can only be guaranteed by a peaceful and stable Palestinian state coexisting side by side. Unfortunately, the illegal occupation of Palestinian lands continues to make such a solution more and more difficult to attain. Mr. President, last September we convened in this very hall and made a commitment to implement the Agenda for Sustainable Development. It is an ambitious and yet achievable agenda whose goals and targets go far beyond the imperatives of economic growth into tackling the root causes of poverty and deprivation and to delivering on the social and environmental dimensions of development. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development marks not only the beginning of a new and even more promising phase in our trajectory as a global body, but also challenges us to develop new and innovative partnerships that I believe will guarantee progress evenly across regions and for all people. The 17 goals and 169 targets underscore the underlying values of the United Nations as enshrined in its charter and provide renewed impetus to its activities in sustaining peace, preserving our planet, and ensuring socio-economic justice, as well as safeguarding the dignity of mankind. Mr. President, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development, together with the Sustainable Development Goals, represent four important mutually reinforcing landmarks. Mr. Secretary General, colleagues, delegates to the Assembly, allow me to congratulate Ambassador Peter Thompson on your election as President of the General Assembly and to assure you of Ghana's support and cooperation during this 71st session and throughout your tenure. I congratulate also Secretary General Ban Ki-moon for his selfless and dedicated service to our organization over the past 8 years and for the achievements during his tenure of office.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. Catch you in the next video.
And if the fates should
Perhaps we're looking
bless us
for one of a kind, the cultural exhibitions around the world, all traveled and places. Stay tuned to my channel, KB Jojo Newsbox, where I intend to give you every vital information, updates, interesting places, places of interest, tourism, and about people, culture around the world. Stay tuned on this channel. We promise to give you more. It's us. Thank you.
And if the fates should bless us with a moment of reprieve, we all could stand together in the silence and just breathe. Rejoice for all the happiness, mourn for all the grief. It's all that I